stuff I agree with you on. I think it's early. So we were saying earlier on in the intro, actually, that we did, it was only 7 months ago that we were talking about Labour being favourites. There's still double that to go until the election. So I think there is time for polling to change. I'm not convinced that polling is exactly perfect anyway. So I think that's correct. There's time, and there's the ability to do things as well. Keir, I don't think we've seen the best of him yet. I think Ian Murray has a lot to offer in terms of offering a kind of almost a shadow Scottish government from down there as well. I think Michael Shanks can be a really important minister for Scotland as much as he is for energy elsewhere. But I do think that what we've seen in the last 7 months has illustrated a problem, and it's a problem that I've seen for a long time with my political history. It's not my first rodeo in that respect.
Sneezes again, isn't it?
Right? So,
the sneeze is coming.
See, the sneeze is coming.
Is coming.
It's been such a popular phrase that even Geoff is using it. But just for those who've been under a rock and haven't been listening to Holyrood Sources over the last few months, when your Westminster party sneezes, you catch a cold. And that is what's happened. So it's very difficult. And sometimes
I recommend Lemsip.
Sometimes Lemsip's not strong enough at the moment for Scottish Labour.
But isn't the problem, Andy?
Keir Starmer needs a hell of a lot more than Lemsip.
But isn't the problem, Andy, is that you are falling into the very same trap that you are complaining about yourself, which is because you are currently, in the last 7 months this has happened, and I think this is partly reflecting what's happening in the polls, is you are reflecting your politics, your political view and decision-making in Scotland through a lens of what's happening at Westminster. You aren't yet thinking about through a lens of what's happening in Scotland.
The top issue in Scotland that's troubling people is the NHS. It's wholly devolved. It's entirely the responsibility of the Scottish Government. They've had an injection from UK Labour of more than £2 billion, but we're not going to see any change. The Scottish Government thinks that more of the same will deliver different results. That's simply not going to happen. The First Minister has sidelined Neil Gray as Cabinet Secretary, brought in Ivan McKee to help manage the finances in the NHS, and they have no new ideas.
Yep.
And to be honest with you, see if you've been around for 18 years, if you were going to have a brilliant new idea, you would have had it by now.
So I agree with all that. But I just think that in the eyes of the normal voter, when they go to the polls and they see the word Labour, they think Keir Starmer. They don't think Jackie Baillie or Anas Sarwar. And that's not a reflection on you. That's the story of devolution, I'm afraid. So it's the same with the Tories. It's the Lib Dems. It's a unionist.
We're going to change.
Can I just add to that, just before you, because it's the same point, but I just want to drive it home, because for the last few weeks we've been asking our listeners what you want to ask, questions, issues you want to raise. I've got a whole list here. Peter, now the vast majority of Scots feel that the UK Labour Party have pandered and lied their way to power and abandoned Scotland's interests. What pitch can you make to show that you lead more than a neglected and irrelevant branch office? Mel also raises that branch office criticism with which you'll be familiar. Dakota, I'd love to know if Anas Sarwar would consider separating Scottish Labour from UK Labour. Kenneth, do you think Keir Starmer and specifically such things as the winter fuel payment have damaged your chances of gaining power in Scotland in 2026? Andrew, do you understand the argument that an independent Scottish Labour Party would be far more appealing to Scottish voters? This is something people care about.
That's something I'd like to pick up.
No, I'm accepting the frame that you're putting to me. I suppose what I'm pushing back on is you are looking at a polling context 15 months out from an election when the entire focus has been on the rights and wrongs of a UK Labour government. And the point I'm making is that once we can get the frame and the choice and in the mindset of people thinking about a Scottish election, and we are framing the choice, demonstrating how the SNP is taking us in the wrong direction, and us demonstrating what we would do differently in the right direction. And I hope we can get into that, because there are clear dividing lines now going into that election in May 2026, and there'll be even more dividing lines coming out of our conference. I think once we get into that frame, the political frame will be very different. Because I think right now, and Geoff will be, because he'll have experience of this, right? We already know what everyone's campaign is going to be in the election campaign. The SNP is not, after what's going to be 20 years, they're not going to be fighting on their record. They're not going to be fighting on what the Scottish Government's done. They're going to fight the election based on, you can't vote for these people, and they're going to point to Westminster. we are going to fight the election on demonstrating what different choices we can make in Scotland. The Tories are going to fight the election trying to pretend they're reform. Reform's just going to say you're all just a shubber of something, and they're going to do that. And the Liberal Democrats are going to say whatever they need to say depending on what community they're in. That's going to be the election campaign. And I believe.
You haven't been listening to the podcast.
Callum, you've lost control.
Right.
Callum has lost control.
One at a time is the essential part.
Can I just come on this? Listen, so I accept the narrative you're putting forward in the sense that it's what narrative, what's framing the people ascribe to at the time of going to the ballot box. Right? I accept that. The SNP are going to say, we stand up for Scotland. We don't have to look to our bosses down south. We're the ones you can trust to do that, right? You're going to say, look at their record, look at the NHS, right? And we're going to see which one wins through. I suppose my cautionary tale for you is my experience. You mentioned it yourself, Anas. Like in 2007, the SNP had won the first breakthrough election. In 2010, we were muddling along pretty well, we felt. It went back to the status quo. Labour Party returned a massive majority at Westminster in Scotland. Now, there was, I believe, an arrogance and a complacency that set in with the Labour Party then, because they thought, we're just back to the status quo, as I say. And in 2011, we had that transformative election, which got the majority. Ultimately, the people of Scotland changed their minds when it came to Holyrood and says, I'm going with the SNP because they stand up for us. We did every bit of focus group. And my worry is that has not changed, to Andy's point.
Again, I don't disagree with you, Geoff. But you've got to remember, John Swinney is not Alex Salmond, and John Swinney is not Nicola Sturgeon. For all my criticisms, and I've got lots of them on different things with Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, but you know what I mean by that. He's not those politicians. Secondly,
do you think he's less capable?
I think, to be honest, he is a bank manager rather than a leader. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I just think that is who he is as a politician. He has been at the heart of this machine for 18 years, and to pretend he's somehow the great new future hope of our country is just not credible. Right. But the other point, though, is, and again, being self-reflective as a Scottish Labour Party, the reason why we kept losing elections in Scotland is because we didn't deserve to win. And the reason why an SNP government went from minority government in 2007 to breaking the system and winning a majority in 2011 is because it was of course partly the chief of staff. Of course, partly the chief of staff. But actually, again, we've got to be reflective and honest ourselves. We can't pretend we were right and the electorate were wrong. I've always believed the electorate were right and we were wrong. Is people viewed, whether they supported independence or not, people viewed that government between 2000 and 2011 as being competent, having a strong record, and having a team that could deliver for them. Now, no one, even the most ardent SNP supporter, can't pretend that when you look at John Swinney, you think record, team, vision. The record is shot to bits, the team is divided, and they've run out of road. They've run out of ideas. As Jackie said, if they had a good idea, it would have been implemented by now. That is a very different frame, and we are going to be putting forward, and again, I hope we come to this, a credible alternative proposition that isn't as Andy often demonstrating, I listen to the podcast, Andy often says, actually, both parties kind of believe the same thing. They both kind of believe the same thing. There's no real difference whether it's one or the other. The only real disagreement they have is on independence. Actually, it's deeper than that. And, independence is, the SNP might choose to make a feature of the campaign. I'm not turning my back on any voter, but we are going to have clear, tangible dividing lines on what it means for a new direction for our NHS compared to the crisis left by the SNP, what it means around a new skill system that guarantees opportunities to close the opportunity gap, again to your point, rather than continued decline in our education standards, what it means to realise our energy potential by breaking some of the ideological blocks, a clear dividing line, and what it means for reinvigorating local democracy, again a key dividing line. There are going to be key, big rewiring of Scotland and the state, dividing lines between us and a tired SNP after 20 years.
We will get onto that because I think they are important. And what I would say though, if you look at the census, okay, 2/3 of this country consider themselves to be Scottish first before British. Now, I think unionist parties have...
Me included?
Yeah. But I think unionist parties have persistently failed to understand that you can want something different for Scotland and still vote no in a referendum, right? Now, you mentioned Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham is seen as being Mr. Manchester now. He's put himself in that position. He'll get down to Westminster, knock on the door and demand things for Manchester. I don't think you're Mr. Scotland yet.
Who's Mr. and Mrs. Glasgow? Who's Mr. and Mrs. Edinburgh? Who's Mr. and Mrs. Aberdeen?
But we are going
Who's
to.
Mr. and Mrs. the Highlands or the Islands?
Well, you need to create
because you're creating a homogenous.
That's a big
That's
dividing
part of the dividing line. Is the SNP believes in one homogenous Scotland? I'm not going to pretend a solution in Edinburgh works for Aberdeen or works for the.
Because you're a listener, you'll know my views on mayoralties and devolution. I think that's a huge thing, devolution inside Scotland. That's a big dividing line that they won't go down that you can. But my point remains that you still have to provide, in order to win in Scotland, irrespective of independence, to win in Scotland, you have to provide a counterbalance to Westminster, no matter who's in charge. Burnham does that. I think you have to do that too, even though it's Keir that's in charge.
Jackie?
I mean, I don't disagree with that. We have very clear proposals to have mayors that are involved in our cities. But to be honest with you, it is about saying we need to reset the agenda. We need to make sure we are delivering, because we currently have a government that just says it'll do things, has countless strategies that sit on the shelves, and there's no delivery. And that's what we need to do. So whether it's on a geographical basis and having mayors of Glasgow and Edinburgh makes sense, because, you know, look at what's happening in Oxford and Cambridge. They have this economic development corridor. We should have that between Glasgow and Edinburgh, notwithstanding, you know, we need to focus on Aberdeen as well.
Aberdeen and Dundee, great
Central Belt bias.
Aberdeen and Dundee, two great cities.
Honest, it helps Aberdeen and
Don't
Dundee
forget the Western
if
Isles.
we have that corridor. And we simply are not there. The government is not doing that. And we are leaving Scotland behind as a consequence. Now, you know, I could talk forever about the NHS, but to be frank, you know, I don't want to be Mr. or Mrs. Glasgow. I want to be in charge of the NHS. I want to deliver a difference in probably what is the second hardest job in government. He's got the hardest, right? But that to me is my mission. That's what I want to do.
And I think it's really important, because what I don't want is this just to be a podcast that we come on and we talk about what's wrong with the current Scottish government. I want to demonstrate, and we want to demonstrate that we've got a plan to do things differently.